depiction of Quidditch players in unlikely poses proclaimed international magical cooperation in proudly flashing cursive. The only thing gaudier than the decorations was the pattern on the minister's robes. He had made the unfortunate decision to attempt a show of neutrality by combining the Irish green and white with the Bulgarian team's burgundy and black. The overall effect was that of a drawing room curtain gone wrong. He seemed not to notice the winces his attire was drawing, however, as he sprang toward them upon their entry and clapped James on the back with eager gratitude. "About time, old boy. I was beginning to think Dawlish's relief would never come. Thank goodness it's you and not that other bloke, what's his name? The one with that horrid cough." "Ah," Minister James interrupted, grimacing apologetically. "I'm not actually here as part of your security detail tonight." "Not?" The minister looked very put out indeed. "Well, what are you doing here, then?" "He's my guest, I'm afraid," Sirius said, reaching out to shake the portly wizard's hand briefly. "Couldn't find anyone else last minute, you know how it goes." "Lord Black." The minister was all smiles again. "Good to see you. So you've put those tickets to good use after all. I was beginning to wonder, the match is due to start any minute." "Wouldn't miss it," Sirius assured him. "You remember Lady Potter, of course." "Naturally." The politician clasped Lily's hand solicitously. "This rickety contraption positively shines with your presence, my dear." Harry struggled to keep her eyebrows from rising in amusement. Is that how Rigel sounded when he complimented people? She might have to cut back on that a bit. "It seems sturdy enough," Lily said, deflecting the compliment easily in favor of looking around the box. "Yes, well, we've the younger Black brother to thank in part for that," the minister said jovially. "Fine work, he does." If Sirius was surprised to hear that Regulus had been the architect behind some of the stadium's infrastructure, he didn't show it. "The Black family delivers only the best," a voice from behind the minister put in. Harry leaned sideways a bit until Narcissa Malfoy came into view. Her husband and son were standing beside her, in the corner of the box where a table of libations had been artfully tucked. "When they can be convinced to stir themselves at all," Mr. Malfoy added with a slight drawl that indicated he was making a joke. "What have you contributed lately then, Malfoy?" Sirius said, not entirely without humor. Before Malfoy Sr. could return the barb, the minister spoke enthusiastically on his behalf. "In fact, Lord Malfoy has recently made a sizable donation to St. Mungo's Hospital." "Yes, very charitable, don't you think?" "It's lovely," Lily said, after an awkward half-second in which it became clear James and Sirius had nothing to say on the subject of Lucius Malfoy's charitableness. "Where will the money be going?" "The children's ward," Lucius said silkily. His expression gave the impression that no one ought to be able to find fault with that. Harry was suddenly very tempted to try. "What a relief for them," she said, smiling up at Mr. Malfoy as though he'd just hung the moon. "Oh." The minister looked down at her and affected an exaggerated look of realization. "Miss Potter, I remember you. Quite a scare at the gala, wasn't it? We are so fortunate that our youngest generation is coming along so nicely. I suppose you have an interest in St. Mungo's, eh? Going to work there one day? You'll be grateful for patrons like Lord and Lady Malfoy when that day comes, I dare say." "No doubt," Harry said, eyes wide with earnest fever. "With Mr. Malfoy's donation, perhaps the children's ward can restock some of the potions they've been out of." "Is it going toward medical supplies?" The Malfoys and the minister all looked at her as though she were a bird out of its natural habitat. After a pause, Narcissa said, "It's going to a new wing, actually." Yes, the Malfoy Memory Wing," Fudge said enthusiastically. "To treat those poor children afflicted with maladies of the mind, you see." "Oh, I do see," Harry said, nodding in patient understanding. "That's a very noble gesture, Mr. Malfoy. I suppose the funds for correcting the shortage of life-saving potions will have to come from somewhere else, though." Even Sirius and James were staring at her uncertainly now. The minister faltered for a moment, clearing his throat delicately. I am not aware of any such shortage, my dear. I assure you the children's ward is well provided for. I'm sure it's very difficult to provide the more expensive treatments to children in need," Harry said, nodding along with the minister's uncertain words. It's a sad fact that the most serious illnesses are often the most costly to cure. And of course the underprivileged are more likely to contract such illnesses, aren't they? If a few of the children can't be saved, well, it isn't really anyone's fault, is it? Lady Malfoy looked visibly disturbed. If there are more pressing needs, our donation should of course be applied to those areas first. We can't allow children to go untreated in favor of erecting structural changes to a building. Draco looked up at his mother with surprise, and his father glanced sideways at her with patient resignation. Indeed, Mr. Malfoy allowed. I'm certain our donation can be reappropriated if there are children in need. The minister looked wide-eyed and dismayed. No, there aren't. Miss Potter, I'm not sure where you got this idea. Why, I met one of them, she said, blinking innocently. She could tell by the looks James and Lily exchanged that they were not buying her act for a moment, but the others all wore expressions of perturbed fascination, all except Fudge, who looked like a man barely treading water. She hoped he could see the waterfall approaching fast. A little girl, not yet old enough to attend Hogwarts. Not that she would, but they didn't need to know that. She had the most rambunctious nature, at least, she did until she contracted Cypher's syndrome. How awful, Narcissa murmured. Well, even modern magic cannot cure some things, the minister said uncomfortably. As you said, Miss Potter. No one's fault. Cypher's solution does have a cure though, Lily put in helpfully. She met Harry's eyes and blinked slowly in response to the look of appreciation she found there. A potion, isn't it? Sirius added, almost idly. A very expensive potion, Harry said, nodding sadly. Her family couldn't afford to hire a potions master to brew it. They turned to St. Mungo's for help, but the hospital was out. Out. Mr. Malfoy repeated carefully. And had been for months, apparently, Harry went on blithely. It's just too expensive to keep in stock without an immediate need, they said. They put her name on the waiting list, of course, but left alone, the disease progressed to its later stages. The poor girl was bedridden, unable to even lift her head from her pillow by the end. The hospital did not set about procuring the potion in the meantime. Narcissa asked, looking close to outrage. Perhaps they did, Harry said, shrugging slightly. The girl's family could not pay for the cure, however, so it is likely her name was passed over in favor of more wealthy clients who, though their need may not have been as dire, could compensate the hospital for the use of such resources. There should be a fund in place for just such a circumstance, Narcissa said stiffly. Lucius, we must look into this. He inclined his head regally, though his sharp eyes found Harry's and did nothing to disguise his annoyance. Of course, darling. Perhaps we can make a separate donation to the potions wing. I'll match it, Sirius said firmly, clapping his hand on Harry's shoulder and squeezing to let her know she'd said enough. The minister's face shifted from despair to utter disbelief. He shook Sirius's hand with a slow blooming smile, looking like a child who'd been told he would have 2 birthdays that year and wasn't sure whether to believe it or not. Well, now, yes, that's a fine idea. Splendid, really. We must take care of the children, I always say. No magical child perishes of a curable disease in magical Britain. No, sir. What should the fund be called? Draco spoke up at last from beside his mother. He addressed the group at large, but his focus narrowed to her as he added, almost challengingly, did this little girl have a name? Perhaps it can be in her honor. She narrowed her eyes for a moment, trying to suss out his expression. Then she realized, he didn't believe her for a moment. His eyes said clearly he thought she'd made the whole thing up. It's Cora, she said, smiling slightly. And I'm sure she'd be delighted to hear she had a whole fund named after her. She's alive. Draco's face said he was aware of how callous the question was, but there was no better way to put it. Oh, yes. Harry said brightly. Someone donated the cure at the last moment and she recovered completely. That's wonderful, Narcissa said, her face relaxing ever so slightly. It should never have been jeopardized to such an extent, of course, but at least the child has not paid for our oversights. I'm certain we can help the ministry see that such an accident never occurs again. Indeed, Mr. Malfoy said. He didn't even attempt to sound enthused. Well, now, that's settled then, the minister said. He wiped his hands on his robes nervously. I hate to step out, but I really must see what's become of the Bulgarian delegation. Can't start the match without them, you know. Be back in a jiffy. He fairly ran from the box, closing the door rather sharply behind him. Radorlish sighed visibly before trailing after him. Was that entirely necessary, Harry? Her mother asked, looking torn between amusement and exasperation. Think of the children, Mum, she said, widening her eyes once more and even summoning a bit of moisture to them for effect. Just go find your seat before you scare the Malfoys away, too. Lily gestured tiredly toward the half-dozen rows of gilt-covered chairs that took up the front half of the box. We're not easily deterred, Lady Potter, Draco said promptly. He followed Harry over to the rows of seats, but didn't say anything for a long moment. She wondered if he was waiting for her to entertain him until he turned to look at her and asked, "How's Rigel?" "Enjoying himself," she said. She might have known that's what he wanted. "He must be, to stay so long," Draco said, turning away from her to frown out at the crowd. "I was sure he told me he would be back for this." "He did plan to be here," Harry said, tone apologetic. The timetable turned out to be less flexible than he thought. Home. Draco lapsed into silent contemplation and Harry took the opportunity to look out at the massive spectacle going on below them. The stadium was so big and their seats were so high that it was like peering down into a fishbowl, if the fishbowl were overrun with ants and all of the ants were in a state of utter delirium, that is. The delay in start time appeared to be causing minor riots in several sections of the stands. She watched Hazaras in brightly lit vests beeline through rows and rows of spectators toward trouble spots. They looked from her height like flickering lamps lost in a forest of restless red and green leaves. "Did you send him a birthday card?" Draco asked abruptly. Harry pulled her attention back to the box and nodded. "Along with a potion I thought would amuse him." "What did he think of it?" he pressed. His attitude was just casual enough to be suspicious. Why did he care what Rigel thought of his birthday present from Harry? He seemed appropriately wary and intrigued, she said. As Draco's eyelids shuttered in response to her words, her eyebrows rose. Why the interest? Her unknowing friend affected a shrug that didn't fool her for an instant. No reason. He didn't say anything about the trinket I sent him, so I wondered if he might be too busy to send an owl. Guess not. She didn't have to be an empath to feel the hurt emanating from Draco's closed-off expression. She assured him quickly. Rigel loved the holster you sent. It was a joint gift from you and Miss Parkinson, wasn't it? He told me the engravings are exquisite. It was a far cry from any mere trinket, and that she knew simply from viewing it through the two-way mirror. She was certain it would prove even more handsome to behold in person, all soft leather and embossed fastenings. Rather than the smirk of self-congratulations she expected, Draco frowned at her. If he liked it so much, why didn't he tell us? Pansy is half convinced we need to get him something else before term starts. Harry grimaced. He can't send letters anymore. The quarantine has been tightened. He can receive mail, but nothing is to leave the affected area until the disease is eradicated. Including Rigel. What? Draco's alarm was palpable. They can't just keep him there. I'll talk to my father. I'm sure we can arrange an international portkey. I'll smuggle it in my next letter if that's what it takes. Hold on, Draco, calm down, Harry said, now alarmed for a different reason. She certainly didn't need Archie being whisked unaware to the Malfoys' manor. The blonde aristocrat paused in his wild planning, perhaps only in surprise that she'd used his given name. She generally avoided it as Harry, despite having been given permission to use it. Rigel is fine. He doesn't need to be rescued. He's just going to be there a little longer while they ensure no asymptomatic cases have been left untreated in the villages. The final stages of eradicating an illness were the most critical. Complete quarantine was necessary to ensuring it couldn't take hold somewhere else. Draco scowled at her lack of urgency. If he can't communicate outside of the quarantine, how do you know he's fine? We have another way of communicating, she admitted carefully. It doesn't fall under the quarantine's restrictions, as it doesn't involve the exchanging of any physical item in or out of the wards. I promise, he's perfectly healthy. And he really does love your gift. Draco looked both mollified and slightly disappointed. She supposed he might appreciate the chance to have Rigel come back sooner, regardless of the circumstances. The door to the walkway opened and 6 fiery-haired Weasleys poured jubilantly into the box. "There you are, Arthur!" Sirius exclaimed. He greeted the older man with a fiercely fond embrace. "Planning on missing the opening ceremony?" "Heard a rumor they'd lost the Bulgarian delegation and had to postpone," Mr. Weasley said, chuckling wryly. "I thought the less time my animals were let loose in here the better for everyone." They turned to see the twins pretending to push Percy over the front lip of the box, and Mr. Weasley winced. Turning with visible effort away from the sight, he greeted the Malfoys with stiff courtesy. "Lord Malfoy. Lady Malfoy. Good evening." "Weasley," Mr. Malfoy returned. After a lengthy pause, he added, almost laughably insincere, "So good of you to come." "Wouldn't miss it," Mr. Weasley said. His voice was painfully upbeat. "You almost did, though," James put in cheerfully. "How do you lose an entire delegation of foreign dignitaries?" "You'll have to ask Ludo when he gets here," Mr. Weasley said, shaking his head with exasperation. He seemed under the impression that Crouch was minding them, but when we saw Crouch he was looking everywhere for Ludo. Said he was supposed to bring the Bulgarian officials to the players' tents for a meet and greet, but never showed. Harry exchanged a look with Draco. "Not very organized, are they?" she commented quietly. Draco turned away from the adults' conversation with an unimpressed huff. "The Ministry couldn't organize a picnic for ants." "Aren't all picnics for ants?" Ginny plopped down on Draco's other side and gave him a sarcastic smile when he frowned at her. From the ants' point of view, maybe Ron sat in the row behind them and was quickly joined by Percy, who put Ron pointedly between himself and the twins. Fred and George seemed unaffected by his show of mistrust, and opted to stand at the wooden railing and look over the field instead of sitting. "I'm surrounded by Gryffindors," Draco muttered. "It's probably not contagious," Ginny said blithely. "Unless you're allergic to fun." "I'm allergic to nonsense." Draco sniffed. "You do seem to be coming down with something," Harry said, blinking with affected concern at his complexion. Draco shot her a betrayed look. "You're one of them." "So are you," she said earnestly. "You just don't know it yet." Draco's expression of suppressed horror was enough to send both Harry and Ginny into poorly muffled laughter. Just when she thought perhaps the blonde pureblood was going to abandon his aloof demeanor and crack a smile, his father called him away. "Draco, come and meet the head of the Department of International Magical Cooperation," Mr. Malfoy said, gesturing to a man with salt and pepper hair and a graying mustache who had just entered the box. A younger man closer to her father's age with a heavy likeness to the first man trailed his footsteps somewhat slowly. "That's Mr. Crouch," Ginny said quietly to Harry, leaning slightly closer to keep the men on the other side of the box from overhearing and gesturing to the older man with her eyes. "He's a sour old geezer, but he planned this entire thing almost single-handedly." "I thought the tournament was Mr. Bagman's department," Harry commented. "If you'd ever met Bagman, you'd know he isn't exactly the planning sort," Ginny said, caustically admiring as only she could be. "He's personable enough, and he raised a dragon ton of galleons in some way or another, of course, but Crouch is the brains behind the whole operation." "You make it sound sordid," Harry said, shaking her head wryly. "You haven't seen the villa yet." Ginny's face smoothed into something deadpan. Harry rather hoped she was joking. They couldn't have actually contracted Vila for the event, could they? "Barty. There you are." Ludo Bagman himself positively steamed into the box, the overwhelming force of his personality enough to nearly eclipse the dozen others who entered in his wake. "I've tracked down the Bulgarian party, as you can see." He gestured grandly to the burgundy-draped wizards as though they were a set of chessmen he'd stumbled across at an antique shop rather than a group of highly distinguished witches and wizards representing the entirety of magical Bulgaria. "With your leave, I do believe we are ready to begin. Hang on. Where's Minister Fudge?" "He left in search of you, not long ago," James relayed. Smiling politely, he offered his hand to one of the Bulgarian delegation members and said, "Welcome, friend. I am Lord Potter, and this is my wife, Lily." "Lord Malfoy is." "Don't bother," old boy Bagman said, shaking his head. "They can't speak a word of English. You may as well be talking to the air." James frowned thoughtfully, still shaking the hands of the Bulgarian party one after another. I'm afraid I don't speak any Bulgarian. Why would you? Bagman sighed. I'm quite prepared to hand them off to you, Crouch, if you don't mind. I do have a game to kick off, after all. Crouch bristled, visibly grasping for poise. I hate to inform you of your duties again, Ludo, but as head of the Department for Magical Games and Sports it falls in your purview to. Harry stopped listening and turned back around in her seat. It was almost embarrassing to listen to elected officials bluster like schoolboys. Draco rejoined them not long after, a disturbed look on his face. At Harry's mildly questioning glance he muttered, I can see why Crouch never talks about his son. Harry rolled her neck as though stretching it and subtly took another glance at the man who'd followed Mr. Crouch into the box. Her earlier impression of an average-looking male in his late 30s wasn't far off. He had a forgettable face, though the expression on it. Why does he keep licking his lips? She asked, sotto voce. Because he's twitchy and weird, Draco said, wrinkling his nose in distaste. I swear to Sorlaser, all politicians have creepy children. He shuddered in remembrance and she supposed he was imagining the infamous Miss Fudge. Your dad's sort of a politician, isn't he? Ginny commented. The implication was there in her smile. Why didn't your parents drown you at birth? Draco asked, almost conversationally. Surely 6 children is enough for even the most industrious of population crisis cultists. Such jealousy is a bit petty among friends, don't you think? Ginny said sweetly. I know I'm the 7th child of a 7th-born child and your family hasn't had more than 2 children a generation in over a century, but there's no need to let it affect our relationship. Draco actually stared at the red-headed girl for a long moment before replying. I'm not sure where to begin. We are not friends. We do not have a relationship. You're the 7th-born of a line so tainted by Muggle blood you might as well be Americans, and my family doesn't need to have 7 children before one turns out to be magically capable. Let's go talk to your parents, Draco, Harry said quickly, cutting the boy off mid-rant and hoisting him up by an elbow. So you admit I'm magically capable? Ginny called after them. Harry sent Ginny a look that said you are not helping and firmly prevented Draco from whirling back around to argue with the younger girl. You really shouldn't let her rile you like that. What would Pansy say? I know what Pansy would say, Draco said, frowning at her. But how would you know? Harry rolled her eyes. Haven't I told you Rigel tells me everything? Why does he keep secrets from us and not from you? Draco complained as she led him toward the table of refreshments. Maybe because I don't pester him about said secrets, Harry suggested wryly. The surest way to make Rigel clam up is to appear interested in his life in any way. She paused as it occurred to her that she was currently giving her friend advice on how to undermine her own boundaries. What was her life coming to? They poured themselves drinks from a bowl of green-colored punch. Crouch's son was loitering near the table as well, but he didn't look interested in partaking of anything. He had adopted a rather closed-off posture of crossed arms and downturned chin and was somewhat sullenly observing everything around him through hooded eyelids that flickered restlessly. She wondered if he was uncomfortable in social settings, annoyed at his father's frequent troubled looks in his direction, or just didn't like Quidditch that much. Whatever his affliction, she'd seen teenagers less petulant. It was unbecoming on a man his age. Lily was now attempting to smooth things over with the Bulgarian delegation. In delicately accented French, she welcomed them to the event, introduced everyone of import in the box, and apologized for their minister's absence. When the Bulgarian Minister of Magic exclaimed in French, "Finally I meet an Englishman with an appreciation for culture," Mr. Crouch's ears turned red. He stuttered out in broken French that he had not thought the Bulgarians would speak any language other than their own. "And why would we not?" the Bulgarian minister replied haughtily, his French nearly textbook. He then devolved into a long string of what sounded like Italian. Narcissa Malfoy smoothly took up the conversation, shortly followed by, to Harry's mild surprise, Sirius. Apparently the last generation of blacks had exposed their children to Italian for enough years that a grasp of the language followed them into adulthood. Mother likes to spend a month in Venice with Aunt Bella every spring, Draco told Harry quietly. She wondered whether her curiosity had been palpable to him. Perhaps this year she should invite the head of the Department for International Cooperation, she murmured back. Crouch was now fumbling through a few disjointed sentences in choppy Italian, but it was obvious he was not entirely sure what he was saying. It is a bit embarrassing, Draco admitted, talking beneath his breath so the man's son wouldn't overhear them. They heard the man snort derisively beside them nevertheless, and she glanced his way to see the flicker of a sneer twist his already twitchy mouth. She didn't know if it was directed at them or at his father, whose neck was now turning red as well as his ears. Regardless, she and Draco exchanged a look and agreed silently to return to their seats with measured haste. "Done making pretty with the politicians, Harry?" Fred asked as she reached her seat and discovered him lounging in it irreverently. "Why? Got a better offer?" she asked, nudging his legs so she had room to walk past him to the seat on his other side. "For you?" Fred waggled his eyebrows in a way that made him look incredibly foolish. "Always. I bet you say that to all your distractions." She pouted, flicking her eyes at George, who was sneaking up behind an unsuspecting Draco in a manner most sly. Draco whirled and George put his wand away so smoothly even Harry doubted whether he'd had it out. "Malfoy," he said cheerfully, putting a proprietary hand on the aristocrat's arm and maneuvering him into the seat on Fred's left. Draco muttered something uncomplimentary about Gryffindor's manhandling him but did not seem to realize he'd allowed himself to be cornered until George plopped down on his left and turned to him with a shark-like grin. "Says something that the witches are the only ones pulling their weight in international relations, doesn't it?" Fred said airily, drawing Draco's attention from George's predatory expression. Draco stole a glance at the adults before saying, in a quietly superior voice, "My father speaks both French and Italian, actually. Spanish, too, and a smattering of German. He's just not foolish enough to volunteer as translator for the rest of the match." "And your mother is?" George asked teasingly. "Mother is enjoying making the officials look foolish," Draco admitted easily. "I dare say she'll look pretty foolish herself when it turns out the Bulgarian officials speak English in the first place," Fred said, laughing. Draco looked scandalized. "They can't possibly. They wouldn't risk insulting the British ministry like that." 10 galleons say they would." George grinned at the scowling pureblood. "You're way off," Draco said stoutly. "Care to put gold on that assumption?" Fred tilted his head in a silent challenge. Draco looked back and forth between the two of them. There was a frown on his forehead that said he knew something was wrong, but he stepped into the neatly laid trap nonetheless. "Can you even afford such a bet, Weasley?" "We'll make it an even 100, if you only play for high stakes," little Drakey George said, his tone indicating that he expected Draco to decline such an outrageous figure. Draco, the proud idiot, said, "It's nothing to me, but what will you put up as collateral?" 100 galleon idea," Fred said. He whipped out a piece of parchment and unrolled it before Draco's eyes. "This, my young snake, is a one-of-a-kind invention by yours truly. Guaranteed to make you a clean nut at any honest purveyor of pranking goods." Harry silently willed Draco to realize he was being maneuvered. He ought to know that the Weasley twins couldn't afford such a bet, and therefore wouldn't be making it unless they thought it a sure thing. The fact that they had such a blueprint on hand was also incredibly suspicious. Draco, however, was studying the parchment with interest. With a haughty sniff, he smiled at Fred and said, "Very well, Weasley. If the invention doesn't mean that much to you, I'll take your outlandish wager." "Wicked," the twins chorused. Fred and George appropriated a hand each and proceeded to shake Draco between them. "Idiots!" Percy scoffed from the row behind them. "What's that, Percy?" Fred pretended to cup his ear in confusion. "You don't want us to spend part of our winnings on a new family isle so Errol stops embarrassing you at work?" "Don't worry. We won't." Percy's ears turned red and he rose with an annoyed huff. He stalked off to stand near Mr. Crouch's son. She wasn't sure which of them appeared more peeved at being there. Welcome, one and all, to the Quidditch World Cup." Bagman's magically amplified voice rang out through every corner of the stadium. A roar of approval followed his pronouncement. The crowd was so loud in its excitement that Harry could almost feel the spells surrounding the top box struggling to keep the noise from overwhelming them. The dampening charms held, but Harry suspected that was due to the incredible integrity of their magic, not the spectators' lack of trying. The adults meandered to their seats and Harry left her friends to sit beside her family. A clap of thunder shook the Colosseum and the whoosh of wind that followed in its wake wasn't wind at all, it was the sound of dozens of the world's fastest racing brooms all whooshing past them at once. The teams had taken the pitch. They zoomed past in green and burgundy comets, and it took Harry a moment of focusing the clear sight spells on her glasses to see that it wasn't just their speed making them look like shooting stars. The tails of the players' broomsticks were emitting clouds of colored smoke that hung suspended behind them. As she watched, some of the riders slowed enough to write words with their bright trails. Well, perhaps words was a bit generous. The Bulgarian players appeared to be coordinating their efforts to draw a picture of the Irish team captain in an unlikely position with a goat. That better not make the front page, Fudge groaned from the row behind Harry. She stifled a laugh at the thought of the red smoke drawing prominently featured on every prophet in London. The riders in green responded by twisting through the crimson fog in a series of acrobatic stunts, both distorting the offensive picture and recapturing the crowd's attention with their spectacular moves. The Bulgarian riders soon followed suit and the audience cheered as each successive trick escalated in skill and recklessness. "Which one is Crumb?" Percy asked Ginny on the other side of the box. "None of them," obviously Ron said loudly, rolling his eyes a bit at his older brother. "These are only the trick riders. You wouldn't waste the real players on stunts like this right before a match." Whatever Percy was going to say in response was lost in the roar that came next. The crowd had noticed the Irish mascots pouring onto the pitch. Like a green tide rolling into the stadium, a flock of locust-like creatures flooded the field. They were leprechauns, and there must have been thousands of them. Harry's eyes widened as she mentally calculated the number of known leprechaun settlements still in existence and the approximate population statistics listed in the compendium of creatures back in Potter Manor. Had the entertainment coordinators rounded up every last leprechaun in existence? No, they couldn't have, she realized after peering a little closer through her magnified lenses. The diminutive green beings below were all male. They rose into the airy en masse, held aloft by some magic of their own making, and began making rounds of the stadium, like a great green thundercloud. From the storm of leprechauns there rained down thousands of glittering gold pieces into the waiting hands of witches and wizards below. Harry brought her hand up automatically to catch a coin that came toward her face, plucking it from the air and examining it curiously. It looked just like a galleon. Except it couldn't be. The Goblin Nation didn't give gold to creatures not classified as beings. She looked toward her parents in confusion. "Do the goblins know the leprechauns are single-handedly destabilizing the magical economy tonight?" she asked, mildly concerned. Lily laughed at her and held up a coin between her fingers. "These aren't real galleons, Harry." "I know," she said. "That's sort of the problem." She was imagining the damage this amount of fake currency inserted into the international wizarding community could do in a relatively short period of time. Inflation, for starters, and probably. "It's leprechaun gold," Harry James said, smiling reassuringly. "It disappears in a few hours." She nodded her understanding, noticing from the corner of her eye that the Weasley children were looking abruptly less enthused about the coins they'd collected. The disappointment was temporary, however, and quickly forgotten in the wake of what happened next. What are those?" The question rippled through the box, echoing the murmurs ripping through the stadium as a whole. The noise level dipped abruptly as thousands of people stopped what they were doing and just stared. There was something happening down below them, something beautiful. Harry felt herself stand to get a closer look, but no matter how close she came to the edge of the box, she couldn't see clearly enough. There was a haze over her eyes, such that she didn't even know what she was looking at. She just knew that it was wonderful. No, that wasn't right. Her mind was itching, a familiar feeling that drew her back from the edge of some precipice and sharpened her consciousness into fighting back. She slammed mental defenses into place, willing her senses to dull and reason to take hold once more. She thought she heard the distant sound of laughter and supposed the Dominion Jewel was enjoying her disorientation. When she came back to herself fully, she was gripping the railing with both hands, staring down with dry eyes at a formation of lovely women with white gold hair and sinuous forms dancing in a way that was something like what Rispara's ladies had put together for the alley tournament, and yet nothing like it at the same time. She pulled her eyes away to see chaos raging everywhere else in the stadium. The pitch had been overrun by witches and wizards alike, all of whom were desperately trying to get closer to the dancing women. No, she realized after a moment of rational thought, not women. Vila. She slowly stepped away from the box's ledge and looked around for her parents. They were sitting calmly in their seats, too calmly, in fact. Their eyes were vacant and their expressions slack. She took a worried step toward them before noticing Sirius had his wand out and pointed at his friends. When he noticed Harry approaching, he grimaced. "All right, there." She nodded. "What are you doing to them?" "Bit of a counter-trance, if you will," Sirius said distractedly. After a few delicate passes with his wand, he put it away and watched with a satisfied smile as Lily and James blinked and looked around. Their expressions were confused, but focused. "What on earth?" James muttered, gripping Lily's hand with a frown. He took in the spectacle occurring on the pitch and stood with a groan. "Bloody Vila!" He rushed toward the Minister of Magic, who was standing on tiptoe and waving merrily to the magical beings below. James shot a spell at the minister that had him stumbling backwards and shaking his head sharply, pawing at his ears. "Thank you, Sirius," Lily said, drawing Harry's attention back to her uncle. Sirius shrugged. "It's a bitch if you don't know the thrall is coming, eh? How did you fight it off so quickly?" Harry asked, impressed. "Dated a Vila once," Sirius said, a devilish grin on his face. "Had to learn to resist it if I wanted any say in the relationship. Doesn't affect me at all anymore." Harry looked around at the box, which was still full of people practically falling over one another to reach the railing for a better view. "They're going to start climbing over that in a moment," she said fearfully, eyeing Ron in particular. "What do we do?" "Watch your father," Lily said, indicating James, who was leaving officials clutching at their ears in his wake. "If you block the ears, it helps a person fight off the influence." "I can't hear their singing, though," Harry said, frowning. "The sound they give off is not at a pitch your mind can make sense of, but the magic still gets in through the ears," Lily explained. "Go help your friends, won't you, Harry? I'll ask Mr. Bagman if he can't get the mascots under control." Harry picked her way toward the Weasleys, noting with a small amount of humor that Mr. Weasley appeared unaffected by the Vila, but was nevertheless having a good laugh at his children's expense even as he subtly prevented them from doing anything too dangerous. Her amusement fled when she saw Draco. The blonde was hunched over in his seat, clutching his head between his hands. He hadn't been hit with one of her father's earringing jinxes, though. His face was screwed up in acute pain and sweat beaded on his forehead and neck. It was his empathy, she realized with growing horror. It was overwhelming him with so many people gone effectively mad in such close quarters. While the spells on the box would likely diminish the emotions he felt from the crowd as a whole, there were still far too many people within the top box currently out of their minds with dazed lust and extreme disorientation. She looked around for his parents, but Mr. and Mrs. Malfoy were still struggling to throw off the influence themselves. Mr. Malfoy looked largely clear-headed, but his attention was on bringing his wife back to full self-awareness and he hadn't noticed his son's predicament. Harry sank onto the floor in front of Draco and put her hands over his ears gently. He flinched away from her but she caught him with a sharp "Ch." He froze as she bent her will toward consolidating her own emotions in a near-meditative state of calm. "Focus on me, Draco. Can you tell where my edges are? Let my emotions block the rest out, then find the part that's you." It was a technique they'd often used to separate Draco from his gift, back before he'd gained a marked control over its filtering. His shoulders trembled slightly but his breath slowed and after a long pause the tendons in his neck relaxed. It was only a minute more before he lifted his head and assumed a posture that was almost normal. "My parents," he said. She could tell he meant it to be a question, but he was still a bit removed from reality. "They're fine," she said, still projecting the same steady calm. She lowered her hands from his head and rose to sit in the chair beside him, affecting casualness for the sake of his dignity. She glanced at Mr. and Mrs. Malfoy and saw that they were observing her sharply from across the box. She smiled reassuringly. They did not smile back, but neither did they come to remove Draco from her presence. No doubt they realized that if she didn't know about Draco's gift already, their coming over to panic over him would give something significant away. What happened? His voice was mildly irritated, a sure sign that he was coming back to himself quickly. The villa enthralled everyone, Harry said. At his confused frown, she realized Draco had never even seen the beautiful beings. He'd been crippled by the collective emotions of those around him before he knew what was happening. Bulgaria's mascots, she clarified. Most people weren't expecting them, it seems. She did glance over at Ginny, who was smiling a bit too smugly at the chaotic scene below them, and wonder how the girl had known there would be villa when even the minister was taken by surprise. Mr. Weasley must have been prepared for them, too, for him to be so unaffected. Perhaps Mr. Bagman had told him something and Ginny had overheard. Harry supposed Ginny's occlumency must be fairly progressed for her to remain in control of her faculties, even considering that she may have been expecting the assault. Whose idiotic idea was that? Draco sneered. Harry had to smile at that. She was privately wondering the same thing. By then, most everyone in the top box had regained their composure, and those not utterly outraged by the turn of events were chuckling with self-deprecating humor and applauding the still dancing villa with bemused appreciation. Mr. Crouch was speaking harshly with Mr. Bagman, who had his hands spread in the universal gesture conveying, "Well, what do you want me to do about it?" Harry's father sent a stag patroness galloping down toward the pitch, where efforts were being mounted to persuade the villa to stop dancing while simultaneously corralling those spectators still swarming from the stands. "And the game hasn't even started yet," she muttered, amazed that wizards could be simultaneously coordinated enough to put together an event of such magnitude and yet still so disorganized where it counted. James had Mr. Bagman over the sonorous charm now, attempting to calm the crowd. After a few unheeded platitudes from the head of magical games and sports, her father simply cast a spell that caused a tone like a broken radio to emit from his wand and into the sonorous charm. Witches and wizards everywhere fell to their knees and clutched at their heads in pain, but the dazed and desperate atmosphere that had filled the stadium dissipated like fog in the wake of a sharp wind. Harry winced, clutching her own ears as reality settled into focus for those around her once again. Down on the pitch, the villa were being escorted from the stadium by scores of security wizards with what looked like metal earmuffs on. The villa didn't go quietly. They summoned fireballs from their hands and shot them off irritably at the security team. The fire only singed at the wizards' coats, so Harry supposed the villa weren't really trying to hurt them. She had read that, in their bird forms, villa could create fire that burned nearly as hot as dragon fire, and had to wonder again who had possibly thought it was a good idea to concentrate so many of them into a stadium of this size, much less without setting proper filtering wards in place around the stands. "Well, now, wasn't that exciting?" Bagman said, laughing in a somewhat forced manner to the box at large. "Ahem. About time we got the game going, yes. Just get the players out here before the leprechauns start up again," Crouch said, rubbing his temples. "Right." Bagman cleared his throat before renewing the sonorous charm. "And now, the teams." All mayhem was forgotten as the crowd refocused on the actual reason they were there. Cheers went up and spectators regained their seats as the Irish national team was called forth from their box. "Here's Ryan. Quigley. Connolly. Trower. Mullett. Moran. And Lynch." The Irish players burst through the dense fireball smoke the villa had left in their wake, flying in a tight formation that marked them as seasoned professionals, well-trained and stylistically compatible. Ivanova. Dimitrov. Levski. Volkov. Vanchanov. Zograf. And Kruaum. The tenor of roaring from the crowd changed pitch noticeably. Harry didn't follow international Quidditch very closely, but even she knew that Victor Crumb was the youngest seeker to play on a national team in well over a century. She had heard he was still in school but had also heard he was 18, so she wasn't sure how that could be true. However old he was undeniably the crowd favorite. Even some of the Irish spectators seemed to be enamored with his legend. Ron whooped in encouragement when the Bulgarian teamed up spectacularly, the steepness of his descent appearing more like a plummet than a controlled swoop until the professional player pulled up in a graceful twist that she was certain required more effort to pull off than the smooth way Crumb executed it implied. To tumultuous applause, the teams took their starting positions above the rather meek-looking referee. She zoomed her omniculars in on the little man with some amusement. He didn't look as though he'd have the constitution for a professional match of any length of time. Did the officials not expect a long final? Perhaps Crumb was just that good. The match kicked off with a cyclone of movement. The first few moments of a Quidditch match were always dreadfully disorienting, but this was something else. She could only follow so many of the players at once, but what she could see looked like someone playing a master's game of wizard chess at high speed. Maneuvers and counter-maneuvers passed before her eyes so quickly that sometimes she discerned the result before the strategy and had to reverse engineer the plays in her head with an awe that likely only scratched the surface of what a consummate fan would be able to appreciate. It became clear early on that the Irish team outmatched the Bulgarians in nearly every way. Their chasers were a seamless wall of talent, steamrolling past the poor opposing keeper in play after play. The Bulgarian chasers were no slouches, but they always seemed to be a beat behind the relentless pace the Irish set. Ireland's beaters, too, monopolized the bludgers fiercely, though she noted the Bulgarian beaters were significantly faster to attack their targets on the rare occasion they stole control of the balls. They were also considerably more pitiless in choosing said targets. It was not 20 minutes in before a substitute keeper had to be brought on for Ireland, their starting player having suffered a punishing break to his left clavicle in a hit that knocked him clear off his broom. "Oh, not Bliggly," Ron moaned, both hands tugging at his hair agitatedly. "He can't track overhead shots for his life." Even if that was true, it didn't seem to matter to the Irish. They never let the Bulgarians have the quaffle long enough to make a decent attempt on goal in any case. The score climbed higher in Ireland's favour and the Bulgarian fans gradually focused more and more of their attention on their seeker. The young player's name spilled out in an almost continuous chant as play escalated, though the focused way the Bulgarian seeker played suggested he didn't notice. She didn't know a ton about the specific strategies associated with seeking, but to Harry his search pattern seemed erratic. Sometimes he doubled back over the same ground twice or three times before moving on to other areas of the pitch. She was not the only one who noticed. "Why isn't he going about it more systematically?" Ginny asked, poking Ron in the side until he deigned to pull his eyes from the pitch and glance her way. "He's Crumb, he can do what he wants," Ron said dismissively, turning back to the match eagerly. Ginny huffed at the non-explanation, but a moment later Draco of all people spoke up from his seat and said, "It's because Lynch is shadowing him. He wants space to maneuver, so he's purposefully disregarding accepted search patterns in the hopes that Lynch will leave off in favor of making his own grid." "It isn't working," Ginny noted wryly. Lynch was so close behind Crumb he could probably count the hairs on the back of the young man's neck. Draco nodded. "He'll have to try something else soon, or put Lynch in a place his beaters can." He broke off as the crowd gasped collectively. Crumb was diving, a dive so much faster than the one he'd displayed at the beginning of the match that it was clear he'd only been warming up before. Lynch tore after him, reckless in his need to close the distance between them. Harry searched the area before them with her omniculars, but couldn't see the gold flicker that would confirm a sighting of the snitch. "It's a feint," Fred said suddenly. "How do you know?" Percy demanded. "He isn't adjusting course as he dives," George said, grinning with excitement. "The snitch moves constantly, you'd have to make minor adjustments to follow its trajectory even if it stayed in the same relative place." They were right, Harry realized, watching Crumb closely. In her lenses she could see the expression of concentration on his face, but his eyes weren't fixed on anything but the ground. Unless the snitch had lost its flight spells and was lying motionless in the grass, he was fainting. They waited for him to veer off, to pull up, but he didn't. The two players plunged toward the earth with deadly speed. "They're going to crash!" Ginny cried. She seemed more excited than dismayed at this prospect. "Lynch is," Ron said, grimacing. Draco nodded distractedly, but the rest of them were too entranced by the scene before them to offer any more commentary. The Seekers were seconds from crashing, falling faster than gravity, and Harry thought surely Lynch would realize, this close to the ground, that they weren't chasing anything after all. His attention seemed to be completely focused on keeping pace with Crumb, however. Didn't he see the ground coming up to meet him? There was a sickening crunch as Lynch attempted to abandon his dive too late and careened into the dirt in a spray of grass and splinters. Crumb, on the other hand, spun out of the dive with a move like a corkscrew, turning his downward momentum into a spiral that carried him parallel to the ground until he'd shed enough speed to pull up into the air once more. Ireland called a timeout as medical personnel rushed onto the field with a stretcher. They would have a few minutes for their medic to patch him up enough to continue or else bring on the reserve seeker. Many in the top box stood and stretched their legs, some migrating to the refreshment table while others discussed the first part of the match with vigor. "Waste of a good broom," I'd say Sirius was saying cheerfully to James and Lily. "Not going to matter if Bulgaria can't score with the quaffle." Ron and Draco were in a heated debate over the outcome of the match, with Fred and George egging each on in turn with ridiculous irregularity. Crouch was attempting to draw the Bulgarian delegation into a conversation by praising Crumb's performance in rudimentary French. He seemed somehow oblivious to the dark glower his son was sending him from his seat, which he hadn't bothered to get up from. Bagman was reading out a series of advertisements over his sonorous charm with a bored expression on his face. Fudge conversed happily with the Malfoys, who returned his conversation with somewhat less obvious enjoyment. A knock on the door preceded one of the security wizards sticking his head in and saying, "A Lord Flint here to see you, Minister." Sirius looked around with interest and stood as Fudge waved for the pure-blooded Lord to be allowed in. The dark-haired man swept into the box with an expression of poised indifference, eyes flickering over the company in a way that was neither friendly nor dismissive. "Good evening, Minister," he said respectfully, sweeping a bow as elegant as any she had seen. "Flint." "Good to see you," Fudge said, coming forward to clasp his hand jovially. "Might have known I'd see you tonight. Where's your boy? Never see you at a game without him." The minister chuckled and didn't seem to notice the flicker of unease that crossed Flint's expression as he replied. "Marcus could not get the time off work, unfortunately. Now that he is out of school, I see considerably less of him," Flint Sr. said, his features settling into a study of wistfulness that was, to Harry's eyes, passably convincing. "They do grow up so fast," Fudge said sympathetically. "Why, my own daughter is approaching her maturity, and I fear she is developing an independent streak a mile wide. But you ought to have brought your wife." "I have not seen the lady in ages, it seems." Flint's smile was regretful, but it did not reach his eyes. "My darling wife is ill and has been for some time, Minister Fudge. She rarely can summon the energy to leave her bed at present. If the Mediwizards do not find some cure soon, I fear for her." The minister looked stricken. "Merlin, Flint, I am dreadfully sorry. Please convey to her my sincerest well wishes." Flint inclined his head gratefully and took a moment to compose his face into something more stoic before turning the subject to more neutral matters. As Sirius stepped forward to greet the wizard he and Archie had often shared Quidditch matches with, Harry marveled at the man's audacity. Was he really going to maintain a fiction of his wife's grave illness until he found her? Or perhaps, she narrowed her eyes and considered the clever way Flint Sr. had laid the ground for grief and sympathy from his fellow wizards. He's going to fake his wife's death, she marveled. It wouldn't be hard, if the knowledge of her supposed illness became common enough. She suppressed a huff as she turned her eyes away from the spectacle. The galling thing was that if she didn't know any better she might believe him, too. He was fairly convincing, if you weren't looking for a lie. How could someone so normal-seeming hide such terrible secrets? An abusive marriage, a runaway wife, and a son that hated him, and there he stood, bold as brass, making himself out to be the sympathetic party. She was tempted to go and introduce herself, perhaps rudely inquire as to the exact nature of his wife's illness, but she held herself back with the knowledge that Mrs. Flint might in fact be best served by the fiction of her own demise. If Mr. Flint were not concerned with searching for her, she could live the remainder of her life without fear. It still rankled that his crimes would likely never be revealed or penalized. She knew that this was somewhat hypocritical of her. Who was she to resent another's secret crimes? She, who did not show her true face to the world. She, who hid behind a wall of carefully laid deception and used emotions to her advantage whenever she pleased. She wanted to believe she was different, that she was not hurting others the way Flint Sr. had, but was that strictly true? She was neck-deep in lies and could no longer say with confidence that she grasped every consequence to her actions. Could she really count herself so different from Lord Flint? The play started up again with a wobbly Lynch taking the air on a fresh broom, and those in the box regained their seats. Play resumed in much the same way, but the atmosphere in the top box began to liven considerably as the match wore on and the spectators grew somewhat restless. The Weasleys were soon shouting over one another in an effort to make their criticisms and predictions heard, and Draco couldn't hold back the force of his opinions very long before he was obliged to argue them at length between plays. Sirius and James jumped in with their own comments, and even Mr. Malfoy was not above a scathing remark when the Irish beaters blundered a good shot. Despite the eclectic group of people, it was fun. The game seemed to draw them outside of themselves, making everyone forget their social considerations for a little while. All that mattered was the match, for most of them, at least. Harry saw Crouch Jr. stalk out with a scowl after a time, evidently fed up with the animated atmosphere, as though the good spirits of those around him were personally offensive. Harry didn't dwell on the man for long. She was having too good a time to ruin it by overanalyzing the negativity of one person. When the Bulgarian beaters singled out Moran and attempted to remove him entirely from play through a combination of blurting and blagging, the crowd roared its disapproval, but no protest was heard more loudly than that of the Weasley twins, who jumped at Ludo Bagman and yelled into his sonorous charm, "That's rubbish." Mr. Weasley looked mortified, his ears a startling shade of red, but then the Bulgarian minister began laughing loudly and Fudge sent Mr. Weasley a grateful look. He therefore refrained from giving the twins a harsh talking to, but did take out his wand and charm their butts to stick to their seats, which were in turn bolted to the floor, much to the continued amusement of the Bulgarian wizards. She supposed this was more entertaining than the match for them at this point, as the Bulgarian team was losing badly to the Irish chasers. The score was now 170-10 Ireland, an unrecoverable figure so late in the game as the players were losing steam and pressure increasingly turned to the Seekers to bring the match to a close. All eyes were on Crumb, but it was Lynch who saw the snitch first. He took off desperately for the golden ball, but the Irish Seeker was in bad shape after multiple collisions and Crumb maneuvered right around him to snatch the little thing out of the air. He held it triumphantly as the stadium erupted with noise, smiling grimly as his team congratulated him. Bulgaria had lost, 160-170, but they had ended the game on their terms, at least. Prolonging the match would only have made Ireland's lead more audacious. The players gathered in the center to shake hands in exhausted good sportsmanship, Lynch even grinning ruefully at Crumb and insisting he keep the golden snitch despite the fact that it was traditionally presented to the winning team. The Irish mascots were somewhat less graceful in their victory celebration. The swarm of tiny green creatures raged about the stadium, showering everyone again in fake galleons and, after several passes, obscuring even the players on the field with the deep green smoke they emitted. Wait, that isn't right, she thought. Leprechauns don't emit smoke like that. It wasn't the bright, Kelly green of sparklers but a deep, grey-green smog that emanated from nowhere in particular and yet was slowly filling the entire stadium with clouds so thick they seemed to dampen the very energy of the crowd. "Dad," Harry said, tugging on James' sleeve without taking her eyes off the darkening smoke. Little crackles of lights were starting to flicker ominously in the center, like quiet lightning. "I don't think that's supposed to be happening." Her parents turned to look at the rising smoke. "Mr. Bagman," James called over to the official. "Is this smog part of the show?" Bagman broke off from his conversation with the minister to crane his head around toward the pitch. I'm not really sure." "Well, no. Not exactly." James looked toward where Dawlish was standing watch at the door and said, "Get a unit on the pitch to find the source of this smoke." The Earl left with a nod, and James turned back to examine the smoke with narrowed eyes. Lily put a hand on James's arm uneasily. "Disgruntled fans?" she asked. "Maybe." James's tone was non-committal. Harry didn't think he believed that any more than she did. The smoke was condensing, almost black now in its density. It was garnering notice from the rest of the stands. She could hear the strangely muted sounds of people shouting, though she could no longer see the stands on the other side of the stadium through the smog. The dark smoke writhed abruptly, coalescing into the center of the pitch and rolling. "It's making some kind of symbol," Lily surmised. There did appear to be a kind of purpose to the smog's development. After a few moments in which those in the box watched silently, the smoke took on a faintly intelligible shape. It was a skull, with hollowed-out spaces of darkness to suggest eyes, nose, and mouth, the later of which was stretched wide in the facsimile of a scream. From the open mouth, more smoke poured, twisting itself into the image of a snake as it stretched outward. "Whatever is that supposed to be?" Fred asked, a tone of somewhat forced sarcasm biting its way through his words. George leant deadpan to disgust in answering. "It looks like a corpse sucking on a." The head of the smoke skull exploded outward without warning, rocking the stadium in a wave of pure pressurized magic. People who'd been standing hit the deck involuntarily as the stands trembled under the violent pressure. Audible cracks echoed like cannon fire through the air. "The foundations," James bit out, but there was no time for anyone to do anything. In the next moment the snake, the only part of the smoky image that hadn't dissipated with the pressure wave, lashed out. Its tail came down like an anvil to score the pitch in a raking movement that left a trail of charred and decayed grass in its wake. They had only a moment to register the symbol burnt into the pitch, a more sophisticated version of the snake-eating skull, before the snake's tongue whipped like an arc of lightning their way. The tongue of smoke had the appearance of intangibility, yet it connected with the wards around the top box like several tons of heated steel. The protective magic held for a second, then buckled ominously. James dove toward the Minister of Magic, the obvious target of the precision attack, and Lily pulled Harry bodily to the ground with a strength she'd had no idea her mother possessed. Even braced between the rows of seats, Harry felt it in her bones when the shielding wards shattered and the remnants of the attack connected with the box itself. The crunching blow that followed took her breath away. She felt the stabilizing charms go next under the strain of damage done to the box's infrastructure. The box began to sway. Harry experienced a light-headed sense of disorientation not unlike the vertigo that set in at the top of a very high tree on a windy day. As soon as she gathered her feet, Harry stood to survey the damage done. There was a gaping hole where the center of the railing used to be. Politicians and dignitaries were strung like discarded dolls about the box, but other than one wizard who was nursing a gash to his left elbow there didn't seem to be any injuries beyond bruises. She took a single step toward the injured man, a half-formed idea of healing him in her mind, but lost her footing as the box groaned and swayed drunkenly beneath her. Even as she grabbed for a handhold, she heard the roar of wood giving way to failed engineering and gravity. The top box split down the middle with a sickening squeal and half of what once had been a level surface became a broken incline with a gaping chasm at its conclusion. The other side of the box remained in place, but was in the space of moments several feet above them. She could see the horrified faces of those on the other half of the split, Ron and Persis included, as her side fell sharply down and away. Harry was closer to the breakpoint than she was comfortable with, but her reflexes were catching up to her shock and quickly suppressing it to functional levels. She braced bent legs on either side of the aisle she was in, keeping her back flat against the incline even as it began trembling against the laws of physics to remain aloft. Levering herself carefully upwards to see over the rows of slanted chairs, Harry spotted her mother further up the incline, looking down at her fearfully even as she hooked her arm between two chair legs still bolted to the platform. "Harry," she called unsteadily. "Are you all right?" Harry nodded her head and gestured to where James was struggling to hold a panicking Fudge a couple rows over. "Help Dad," she called back. "I'm Ginny." Mr. Weasley's frantic shout drew Harry's head around with a snap. The man was struggling to find a way down from the elevated edge of the broken box, which jutted out over their side like a cliff, but there was a good 6 feet between the intact half and the half Harry was on. Any attempt to jump down would likely result in a roll off the broken end to whatever gut-wrenching fall waited below. She spared a moment to pray that there hadn't been anyone directly below the box when it cracked in two, then refocused on what she could do now. Harry adjusted her foothold so that she was nearly standing between the chairs, leaning sharply away from the incline to keep her balance. Ginny was in the front row, lying flat against the sloped platform, so close to the end that her feet dangled over open air. She held onto a chair leg with her left arm, but her right dangled at such an angle that Harry knew immediately it was broken. The girl's face was pale and she panted visibly against the pain she was in. Fred and George were 2 seats left of their sister, and had somehow managed to remain sitting upright despite the shocks that had sent everyone else sprawling. No, she realized, they were still affected by the sticking charm Mr. Weasley had put on them earlier. She eyed the empty space where the railing had once been in front of them and decided those charms had probably saved their lives. Now, however, they were rendered incapable of moving to pull their sister away from the edge. Harry grasped the chair to her left firmly and kicked off with her right foot to hoist her leg over until she was straddling it. Thus positioned, she relinquished one of her handholds to retrieve her wand from an inside pocket. If she could get a clear line of sight to the girl, she could levitate her out of harm's way. Before she'd got through half the incantation, however, Ginny was already moving. The redhead screamed as her legs and torso became airborne, but she wasn't sliding, she was floating. Someone else had the same idea Harry had. She looked around, but no one else on the broken side of the box had their wands out. "Let go, idiot." Harry whipped her head up toward the ledge above them, where Draco's head and torso glared down at them. His hand held a wand steady on Ginny's partially floated form with white knuckles. Ginny seemed to hear him, but couldn't move her head around to see well enough to be comforted. She hesitated on letting go of her desperate hold on the chair. Harry shuffled down a chair until she came into Ginny's line of sight and called, "It's all right, Ginny. We've got you." She added her levitation charm to Draco's. She trusted the blonde boy, but lifting a human body with the spell was more difficult than he likely knew. Ginny let go with a tremulous gasp of fear and squeezed her eyes shut as her body left the angled floor entirely. Harry kept a steady flow of power to support the girl's weight and let Draco control the motion on his end. The pure-blooded boy was a study in concentration as he guided Ginny up the remaining feet to the intact half of the box. Harry let her levitation charm drop and scanned about her for any more pressing disasters. Seeing no one in immediate danger of falling, she hefted herself nimbly over another row until she could reach the twins. "All right, there?" she asked, breathing somewhat heavily with exertion. Fred scowled down at the chair he was stuck to. "We don't know the counter-charm," he growled, attempting to hurl himself out of the seat without success. George put a hand on his brother's shoulder with grim patience. "Don't do that, Freddy, only think what would happen if you succeeded." Fred looked at the gaping lack of railing in front of him and swallowed. "Right. Well, do we saw our asses off or what? Can't your father cancel it from where he is?" Harry asked, peering up toward where Mr. Weasley was attempting to split his attention between Ginny and the twins. "Broke his wand, I think George said. Saw him toss it aside when it didn't work before he tried to climb down to us." Harry didn't know the counter-charm for a sticking spell either. But she knew someone who did. "Sirius," she yelled, looking around for the dark-haired wizard. "Over here, Harry." It was her mother. She was wedged in a kneeling position near James and the minister, and on the slanted floor between them was Sirius, looking very much unconscious. "Sirius," she said again, her voice less firm. There was blood about his head, fresh and glistening. "He'll be okay," Lily called. There was a confidence in her voice that was reassuring. "Can you three make it over here? We'll starting levitating you up to the others." Harry shook her head. "We need the counter to the sticking charm," she told them, gesturing to Fred and George's predicament. "I'll do it," James said, holding the minister down even as he shifted himself up to get a clear sight line. "Tell me when you're ready." The twins quickly grasped the arms of their chairs and braced their legs for the release. Harry sent a thumbs up to James, who responded with a vigorous, Libra Corpus. Fred and George let out shaky sighs of relief as their backs separated from the seats at last. The three of them picked their way over to the adults, checking aisles as they climbed over them for anyone else trapped or unconscious. They found no one else, and Harry hoped it was because the rest had been thrown to the side of the box that didn't break away, not because they had slipped over the edge before anyone had regained the wits to notice. There were 4 or 5 ministry officials huddled near where Minister Fudge was curled up under James' watchful gaze. Adding in her family and the twins made about a dozen people who needed moving. First Sirius needed tending to, however. Harry took out her wand again and crouched beside her uncle, using her knees to brace herself in the mouth of an aisle so her hands stayed free. Here Fudge protested weakly from where he huddled against the platform. "No underage magic." Lily interrupted. "I think this falls neatly under the exception for dangerous circumstances, don't you?" "Do what you must, Harry." She nodded, choosing to take that as blanket permission to do whatever magic she deemed prudent until they got out of this mess. She had a feeling the night was far from over. A stream of diagnostic charms told her all she needed to know about Sirius' condition. He'd cracked his head hard enough to put his lights out on impact, but his brains were in no danger of coming out his ears. It was the work of minutes to fuse the thin skin at the back of his head together neatly and reduce the swelling. There was nothing she could do about the headache he would have upon waking, but she deemed him safe to renovate after a final check. Lily smiled at Harry proudly, a small moment of warmth in a chilling situation, and woke Sirius directly. The prone wizard inhaled sharply as his eyes flickered open and he groaned like a man hung over. "Why's the world tilted?" he garbled out between moans. "The box split in two," James explained shortly. "My head feels split in two," Sirius grouched. He attempted to sit and hissed at the dizzying sensation the movement caused. "Here, Uncle Sirius," Harry said, reaching deep into her pocket. She'd thought it might seem odd to carry her potions bag into the stadium with her, so it was miniaturized in her pocket. She would never be without it, but that didn't mean she didn't know how strange it looked to carry it at a sporting event like the Quidditch World Cup. Her uncle took the potion she handed him without question, knocking it back and grimacing at the taste. "Aren't you prepared?" he said wryly. She huffed. "What's the point of an emergency supply of anything if you don't have it in an emergency, Uncle?" She peered into his eyes in an attempt to judge his coherency. Sirius waved her off and took stock of his surroundings. He peered about the steeply listing platform, taking in the splintering wood and whining metal where the high end of the slope was still connected, albeit precariously, to the box's original frame. He then looked up toward the ledge above them, grimacing resignedly. "I suppose the door to the stairs is up there, eh?" "What a talent for summation you have," Lily said, letting out a shaky laugh. "Yes, we have to get everyone up there before we can evacuate this death trap." "Don't suppose those wankers up there stuck around to see what became of us," Sirius said, sounding not at all hopeful about the prospect of rescuers. "Our father is up there with Percy and Ron," George reported. "His wand is broken, though, and Ginny is hurt." "Best get you two up first, then, so you can help your sister," Sirius said, reaching for his own wand. "Send Harry up first," Fred said, shaking his head. "She can heal Ginny. We're useless either way." Harry settled the argument before it could gain steam, simply brandishing her wand at Fred and catching him in a levitation charm before he had the sense to resist. She ignored his offended yelp and let her magic carry him surely up to the platform above them. She saw several pairs of arms reaching out over the ledge to guide the redhead in the last foot or so and released her spell when she felt a tug against her control on the other end. "You're next," she warned George, who was looking at her in equal parts exasperation and gratitude. "I've got him," Harry, Lily said, putting a hand on her arm. "Rest your magic. You may need it again before the night is out." She didn't know how to tell Lily that she could have lifted all of the others to the platform twice before feeling the drain on her magic, so she let her mother lift George with a simple nod of acquiescence. Sirius turned his wand on Harry, but the minister's hand shot out and grasped at the Black Lord's arm pleadingly. "Send me up," Fudge said, voice shaking. "I must see to, that is, the people need to know I've survived. I must find the Bulgarian minister. We must make a statement." Sirius removed Fudge's clawing hand with restrained impatience. "Minister, we will send you after Harry. Surely you see that the children must go first." "The children?" Fudge trailed off uncertainly, but looked around at his retinue and nodded quickly. "Yes, that is, of course. Send her along, then, and I'll follow just after." Harry suppressed the urge to roll her eyes at the severe distortion of priorities from which politicians appeared to suffer. She looked at her parents as Sirius' spell caught her weight and said, "I'll wait for you," before they could give her instructions to the contrary. The magic hoisted her upward on a tide of invisible power, and a moment later she was touching down on the upper ledge in a space that had been cleared for the purpose. There were more people still in the destroyed box than Sirius would have guessed. The Bulgarian party was still there, from what she could see. They were in the midst of a furious argument, in English, no less, with Mr. Crouch and Mr. Bagman, both of who seemed to be completely at a loss as to what they were meant to be doing. Mr. and Mrs. Malfoy were standing protectively close to Draco, whose eyes locked onto hers as she looked their way. "How many more?" he asked. His voice was steady but his face held a pallor that didn't bode well for how his occlumency was holding up under the panicked emotions of so many shocked and terrified people. "9," she said. "They may need help levitating everyone up." Here she looked meaningfully at all the grown witches and wizards standing about uncertainly. "The minister and his retinue are still down there." Mr. Crouch sprang to the ledge, or at least to a space near the ledge from which he could peer down to the party below anxiously. He was almost knocked aside as Fudge came weightlessly flying over the edge and onto the platform. The portly man clutched at his chest as he found his feet and looked around. Zeroing in on the Bulgarian party, he stumbled over and began haranguing them about international incidents and unforeseeable disasters. Crouch followed him to mitigate, and the group once again dissolved into uselessness. Harry turned from the scene with disgust. She could be useful, at the least. Ginny was sitting in one of the chairs nearby, looking collected and annoyed at her family's hovering. "Come to patch me up?" Ginny asked as Harry knelt before her. "Just a numbing spell will do until I can get out." Harry ignored the girl's startled yelp as she magically twisted the bone back into place with a deft turn of her wand. She had done it on animals a number of times and knew that the spell prevented the nerves from sending most signals during the resetting. It hadn't hurt much, but the sensation of muscle and sinew moving without one's conscious control was unpleasant nonetheless. "I'm gonna be sick," Ron said, averting his face from his sister as her arm twitched and shuddered under the magic's insistent nudging. Once the arm was straightened to the spell's content, Harry set about actually healing it. This was a much more gentle process, and Ginny's face relaxed under the warmth of the magic. Knitting the bone and surrounding tissues back together also took longer than simply setting it did, so Harry settled in for the time being. "What's happening with the rest of the stadium?" she asked Mr. Weasley as she worked. He shook his head slowly. "Nothing good. Ours was the only portion of the stands directly attacked, so nothing else has collapsed. People are panicking, though. I fear the security wizards will have their hands full preventing a stampede." Harry wondered that everyone hadn't already cleared the stands, but after casting her mind back over the events since the end of the game, she realized not as much time had passed as she'd assumed. It had been the rush of action and her own hyper-awareness slowing her experience of the event. That, and there probably weren't enough exits to the stadium for any sort of expeditious exodus. At the periphery of her awareness, she could hear Bagman attempting at last to calm the crowd. At what she suspected was the minister's urging, he had a sonorous charm going full blast, saying, "Ladies and gentlemen, please do not panic. The match is now over. There is nothing to fear. Proceed in an orderly fashion to the nearest exit and no harm will befall." Bagman's platitudes were drowned out by an unearthly howl that seemed to fill each corner of the stadium. It started as a wind, whipping through her ears so intimately it set her skin crawling. The white noise fell away by degrees until she could hear words, spoken as though emanating from just over her shoulder. "What kind of spell is this?" she wondered with unease. It was a terrible whisper of a voice, almost unrecognizable in its inhuman, echoing lisp. More terrible still were the things it said. "Lies," the spell whispered shouted into her ear. She couldn't help but flinch at the way it filled her mind with harsh syllables. She kept her concentration primarily focused on Ginny's healing, but she could not block out the voice entirely, and it rose and fell like an overbearing symphony in the fringes of her consciousness. "There is much to fear. This is the advent of a new age in the wizarding world. A war against the lesser is begun. Tonight we reclaim our world from the stain that desecrates it, we come to purge the poison that infects the weak and whole. Consider this a warning. Mudbloods who leave our world will be spared. All who remain shall be hunted. True wizards associating with filth will be cleansed alongside it. Choose your side, Wizards of the Isle. Join us or stand aside. The Death Eaters devour all who stand against them and deliver the souls of the unworthy to the fires of the darkness." The message ended, but the words seemed to be stuck in Harry's mind, like the echoes of a bad dream that took too long to fade upon awakening. "What the bloody hell was that?" Ron muttered, white-faced and shaking. "Never mind that now," his father said firmly. "As soon as Ginny's arm is well enough to move, we are leaving this stadium. Fred, George, Ginny is your responsibility from now until we set foot inside the burrow, understand?" The twins gave resolute nods, the stubbornness in their chins just daring Ginny to protest. She didn't, for once, instead frowning fiercely and snapping at Harry, "Is it fixed yet?" "Almost," she said. She wasn't about to send the girl into a volatile situation with a half-healed arm. "Dad," Percy hissed suddenly, naked fear in his voice. Mr. Weasley whirled to look at something out of Harry's line of sight and inhaled sharply. "Get down, all of you," he yelled. Harry didn't think twice about pulling Ginny down by her good arm and shoving them both into an aisle. Ginny growled as her still tender arm was jostled and Harry reached out with her healing magic automatically to soothe it while at the same time twisting her head as much as she was able to look for the threat. "Did you see?" she asked Ginny. "Masked riders," Ginny panted. "Black robes. On brooms. Came from above, I think. That's all I saw before you attacked me." "Saved you," Harry disagreed. She flinched as something touched her head, but it was soft and fluttering. It was a piece of parchment, and it was followed by half a dozen others. "What on earth?" Ginny pushed at her and they both moved into crouches. They risked a look out at the stadium, and the scene that met Harry's eyes was so surreally unexpected that it didn't immediately register as intelligible. There was indeed a swarm of black-robed figures in silver masks, and they were on brooms, but whatever she'd imagined them doing, throwing spells or curses, maybe, it didn't predict them throwing what looked like bundles of newspapers down into the stands. The masked riders tossed the stacks of papers and then shot simple dispersing spells after them. The stacks then exploded into hundreds of leaflets that rained down harmlessly onto the crowd. "You saved me from a paper cut," Ginny said dryly. "Thanks ever so." Not amused by the redhead at that particular moment, Harry pulled the girl's arm toward her and healed it as fast as she could manage safely. Faster was more uncomfortable, but she thought they were beyond such concerns at this point. Ginny hissed at the pins and needles sensation, but sighed with real relief when Harry let her go at last with a satisfied nod. Ginny tried out her arm, gingerly at first and then with more vigor as it held up to her motions. "Thanks, Harry," the girl said, momentarily sincere. Her face relaxed into cynical lines a moment later. "Now let's get the hell out of here." "Go with your family," she said, turning Ginny over to Fred and George's protective care. "I'll see to mine." "Be safe," George called after her, eyeing the leaflet-tossing wizards with cold apprehension. Unburdened, the masked assailants had begun to flee up and out of the stadium into the night. She returned the sentiment distractedly and sought out her parents. James had procured Eras from seemingly nowhere and was taking charge of the situation unequivocally now that everyone had been retrieved from the broken portion of the box. "Dawlish, contact HQ and tell them we need immediate backup," James barked. "Stepson, go down to the locker rooms and confiscate the players' brooms. Get Squad C airborne and after those masked wizards. Granby, find the wardsmiths on call tonight and tell them to take down the anti-portkey wards around the grounds, then the anti-apparition wards. People are going to want to leave quickly and we don't have enough portkey stations standing by to make any kind of speedy evacuation." "That's gonna take time," Granby protested. "Hours, maybe, them wards are anchored in a dozen places." "Well, get every ward master in England on it," James snapped. The anti-app wards were anchored by Master Black himself. Granby snapped back. "I'm telling you, our guys can't just unpin them on a whim." Meanwhile Bagman had decided to be useful again and was announcing over the sonorous charm, "All players report to the top box with brooms in hand, by order of the Minister of Magic." A glance over at the respective Ministers of Magic showed the pair of them utterly uninterested in any such order, being preoccupied in an argument over whose respective fault the current circumstance really was. "Winborn, take Murphy and escort the dignitaries out of the stadium," James said when he could be heard once more. "Take them directly to the perimeter of the wards and use the emergency portkeys to get them off the grounds." "Why can't we take the brooms to the portkey stations?" Fudge broke in, abruptly distracted from his political machinations. "There aren't enough for you all," James said uncomfortably. "We need to acquisition the majority to get our men in the sky to oversee the situation and provide close air support if events escalate further." "Just the two of us," then Fudge spluttered, grasping his fellow minister like a lifeline. James visibly fought a grimace and lost. "All right, Minister. If you and the Bulgarian minister would like to wait, I can escort you to the perimeter myself by broomstick shortly." Lily met James' eyes and smiled resolutely. "Harry and I will do just fine, dear. We'll be waiting for you when you come home." "I'll look out for them," Sirius added, clapping a hand on Harry's shoulder hard enough to make her stumble a bit. James shook his head slowly. "I have a job for you, Sirius." In a blur of crimson, the Bulgarian seeker, Crumb, touched down in what was left of the top box. He made straight for his minister, spurring a short and one-sided conversation in which the Bulgarian minister gestured from Crumb's broom to James and back. Crumb handed over the Firebolt XP without so much as a wince. James passed it to Sirius a moment later. "Get to the edge of the woods and apparate to your brother's house," James told him. She'd never seen Sirius take a broom so gingerly. "We aren't on great terms at the moment." "Still, he'll come if you ask him," James insisted. Harry thought he was probably right. Whatever Regulus thought of Sirius, he respected the position of family head unequivocally. "No one else can get the wards down fast enough," James concluded. Sirius looked at Lily and Harry, frowning. "I don't like this. At least let me take Harry." James shook his head staidly. "She'll slow you down. People are panicking already. Go now, Sirius." With a final, uneasy glance at Lily and Harry, Sirius turned and leapt off the edge of the box, rocketing into the night on wings of urgent resolve. Winborn and Murphy began herding the ministerial delegations briskly toward the door, which had been knocked partially askew during the box's splitting. The majority of those remaining who were not directly affiliated with the governmental parties nevertheless followed close behind, likely judging the escorted group to be a relatively safe option amidst the chaos. Harry had the disturbing thought that standing next to high-ranking officials in the midst of a politically motivated attack was phenomenally ill-advised, but with only one exit from the box there was no choice. She stuck near to her mother, falling into step behind the Malfoys, with the Weasleys pressing close behind them. On the metal landing outside the box, their progress was stymied. Witches and wizards were attempting to evacuate from every box along the narrow walkway, to the point that passage between their box and the nearest lift access was impossibly congested. Judging by the frustrated shouts coming from that direction, Harry wasn't sure the lifts were even functioning at this point. She looked the other direction, toward the junction with the rickety metal stairs that wound their way back and forth around the outside of the stadium like trails in an overly ambitious ant farm. "Mum," she said, pitching her voice over the crowd with difficulty. Lily followed her gaze and grimaced, but nodded. "We're never going to make the lifts," Lily called to those around them. "We should take the stairs." Lady Malfoy looked unenthused by the prospect. "It's little more than scaffolding," she pointed out. Harry could barely hear her cultured voice amidst the noise. "Not designed for serious traversement. Unless you've got brooms up your sleeves, we've few options," Mr. Weasley said firmly. Eyeing the crush of people all pressing toward the lifts, he directed Percy and Fred, who were the furthest back, to shift sideways. "Boys, make a path to the stairs, carefully. George, keep hold of Ginny." To Lily and the Malfoys he added, "Let's keep the children to the center." Harry was unceremoniously put between her mother and Draco, who was bracketed by his parents on the other side. Ignoring the ignominy of being treated like the bumbling ministry officials, Harry began the slow plod toward the stairs. The only thing that made their passage possible was the fact that everyone else was eager to move in the other direction. Room was made as witches and wizards wriggled forward into the space they vacated. It wasn't until they reached the first stair and Draco nearly stumbled that Harry realized he was not holding up as well as he pretended under the overpressure of so many heightened emotions. He clutched the side railing with white knuckles and attempted to descend despite the glazed, half-focused look in his eyes that told her he was processing too much empathic data to be fully cognizant of his physical surroundings. Without hesitation, she propped her right arm under his left elbow and steadied him. "Focus," she said, a bit sharper than she intended. Her worry gave her words an edge. "Find my emotions and forget the others." It was a sign of the enormous pressure overloading his gift that Draco clutched blindly for her wrist with the hand that was not holding the rail, seeking the skin-to-skin contact that heightened and narrowed his empathy markedly. She knew from helping him learn to control his gift that his ability to sense a person's emotions was influenced by proximity, and that if he touched a person, his perception of outside emotions diminished to almost nothing. The trade-off was that the emotions of whomever he was tuned to became hyper-magnified, easily overwhelming if not managed properly. For that reason, anchoring, as they came to call it, only helped his control if the person he touched held their emotions extremely static. Harry's occlumency allowed her that control, and she exercised it ruthlessly as she directed Draco subtly down the stairs. "How are you, so damn calm?" Draco hissed out between long, deliberately even breaths. Her serenity was exaggerated as she projected complete placidity for his benefit, but even beneath her mental shields she wasn't, truthfully, too ruffled by the situation. It was the plain truth that she had been in worse circumstances than an overcrowded stairwell. To Draco, She simply said, I am calm because I need to be. Why can't everyone do that, then? Draco grumbled with annoyance. His eyes were clearer, now, and he seemed less likely to fracture into pieces any second. Harry couldn't help the short thrum of amusement that passed through her at his words. How like her friend to resent others for their unintended effect on his empathy. No doubt he would happily require occlumency be added to the standard wizarding curricula if it meant he wouldn't be inconvenienced by other people's excitability. The blonde wizard let out a burst of involuntary laughter, then shuddered and glared at her. Keep it to yourself, he snapped. Apologetic, Harry reinforced her occlumency more firmly, tamping down on all superfluous emotion rather than simply the tension-causing ones such as worry and paranoia. Draco's face smoothed out and he nodded at her gratefully. He stood a little straighter, no longer leaning against her for support, though his left hand didn't release her wrist as they continued downward. They were not the only ones to think of using the stairs, and their progress slowed incrementally the closer they got to the ground. Each time they were unable to move forward, they had to fight to keep from being crushed by those behind them. Their group was forced closer and closer as they lost space to the desperate press of bodies caught up in forward momentum. Harry recalled with disgust the single entrance to the stadium she'd passed through hours before and hoped there were those on the bottom floor with enough sense to blast alternate exits from the other ends of the stadium. Then she imagined the effect such uncontrolled efforts might have on the overall stability of the temporary magical structure and thought better of it. With any luck, Sirius would have Regulus Black on hand shortly and they could all just apparate home. During one of the long pauses in their headway, Harry looked down over the edge of the railing to judge their progress. They were just above the tallest treetops, but in a couple of levels they would be close enough to consider jumping over the railing. The more compressed their group became on the stairway, the more she thought getting trapped in the bowels of the stadium trying to reach the main entryway would be a bad idea. People were going to get trampled or crushed unintentionally at the rate things were going. The line of bodies moved and she turned away from the rail, but a flicker of strange light caught her periphery and she whipped her head back around with a snap. Draco let out a sharp breath and she belatedly smoothed the ripples in her emotions. He had already leaned around her to see what had alarmed her so, however, and when he, too, saw the orange light past the tree line he cursed. The tents are on fire, someone shouted from above them. She wondered exactly how stupid a person had to be to literally scream fire in the midst of an already panicked crowd, but a moment later she had no time to care. The weight of the crowd around them became frenzied with stymied panic and Harry was knocked into Mr. Weasley's back with a grunt of surprise as Mrs. Malfoy lost her balance on the stairs behind them. We've got to get off these stairs, Draco said, voice tight as he attempted to brace himself next to her against the rail. Still too high to jump, she told him. 100 feet, I think. There has to be another way down, he said, almost to himself. He frowned at her for a long moment, and then she realized he wasn't looking at her, he was looking at her potions kit, which was unshrunken and pressed tightly to her body, cushioned from disruption only by the built-in spells that protected the vials within from jostling. She put a protective hand on her back, knowing where his thoughts were headed. She had told him as Rigel that her cousin Harry had been the one to develop the modified weightless draft. I don't have any modified ones. But you have regular weightless drafts? Draco asked, triumph lighting his expression. She frowned, mentally calculating her current store levels. She was going to use them in an experiment over the weekend for her project with Snape, so she did have a handful of regular weightless drafts. 6, she said after a moment. Not enough for all of us. Enough for your family and mine, Draco pointed out. She didn't even have to say anything before he shrugged. Just saying, he muttered. Harry was too busy doing calculations in her head to entertain his callous suggestion that they abandon the Weasleys. If the 6 heaviest of us take the potion and the rest of us use levitation charms on one another to slow our falls. It'd be too uncontrolled, Draco said. There's no way we could keep levitation charms steady while falling. And it's too dark to maintain line of sight from up here. What if the spell could be steadied? She spoke aloud even as she tried to remember how many base potions she had in her bag that could be shape-imbued. At least a dozen, she was certain. If I put a levitation charm in one of the neutral base potions, it won't make the drink a featherlight, but it will reverse the pull of gravity nonetheless. I just don't know if it will be too much, we might end up floating up into the sky uncontrollably. Draco's face was a study in concentration as he tried to follow her thinking. We could pair up, one weightless draft with one levitation charm. The anti-gravity of the levitation charm would be balanced by the controlled fall of the weightless draft. A levitation charm powered for one person can't lift two, even if the other one is very light. Should make for a very slow fall between the two. In theory. She grimaced. He nodded unhappily, wincing as they were both pushed forward again as a surge came inexplicably from further up the stairs. I'll take theory over being crushed, Ron said from ahead of them. They looked up to see him craning his neck to see over his dad's shoulder. I didn't catch all of that, but let's do something. The others around them were looking down with mixed trepidation and determination at Harry and Draco. Lily, half wedged between the rail and Mrs. Malfoy, gave them a grim smile. If you've got an idea, now would be the time to try it. Harry's hands flew into her potions kit, drawing out vials from various pockets with the ease of intimate familiarity. She passed them off to Draco and Mr. Weasley as she ran out of hands. The weightless drafts go to Mr. and Mrs. Malfoy, Mum, Mr. Weasley, and the twins. She knew without a doubt that Fred and George weighed more than their older brother, where he was skinny and lanky, like Ron. The twins had the build of true beaters, broad-shouldered and well-muscled. When she was left with 5 vials, held between her and Draco, she closed her eyes for the barest of seconds, her core awareness pulsing out until she'd connected a cord of her magic with each of the vials. She'd never simultaneously imbued along multiple connections before, but the amount of magic required for each vial was negligible for her, just enough to levitate one human-sized object, and since it was the same type of magic going through each one, she didn't foresee any issues. The vials lit up with the speed and force with which she imbued, molding her magic into the form of levitation charms and pushing it down into the inert solutions as rapidly as she dared. The entire process took her perhaps a minute, and by the time Draco had let out a surprised yelp at the heat that passed into the potions, she was already taking all but one of them from him, passing 3 up to Percy, Ron, and Ginny. When we take ours, our feet are going to leave the ground, she warned them loudly. Wait until your partner is ready to jump. This seems rather reckless, Mrs. Malfoy said, eyeing her vial dubiously. At Harry's patient look, she said, It's not that I don't trust you, young lady, but this is my son's life you're asking me to risk. There is no guarantee that your potion levitation charm will last until we reach the ground. Harry nodded. I'll go first, then. No, Draco bit off the rest of his exclamation, scowling as Harry raised her eyebrows at him. That's stupid. Let an adult go first. Harry wondered if he was worried about losing his emotional anchor, but surely he realized that getting away from the crowd would help more than anything else. Lily struggled to reach Harry and managed to get a hand on her shoulder after a moment. There's no use dithering further. We will send green sparks when we reach the ground, so you know it is safe to follow. Before anyone could protest further, Lily downed her vial of weightless draft and pushed her way to the railing with unexpected strength. She swept her feet over the edge and made room for Harry to climb up beside her. Harry wrapped an arm tightly around her mother's waist and gulped back the hastily imbued potion without hesitation. It went to work after a moment's delay, and Harry felt gravity desert her as her mother's arms closed around her torso. Lily waited to make sure the magic keeping Harry aloft was stable, then pushed strongly against the rail. There was an eerie moment of horizontal motion as Harry and Lily drifted out over open air, away from the stadium. Before they had gone too far toward the tree line, their bodies decelerated and they began to drop, ever so slowly, toward the ground. While normally a weightless draft would allow one to sink at a safe pace straight down through open air, the combination of a weightless draft with Harry's self-levitating form made the two of them into an awkward balloon of sorts. Their path to the ground zigzagged in a difficult-to-predict pattern so that, when they did touch down at last, it was much later and further from the stadium than Harry would have originally anticipated. They were almost in the forest itself when they landed, somewhat removed from the mob of people pouring out of the stadium's entrance in every direction. Lily let go of Harry with a smile, which abruptly fell away as Harry began to float upwards again. Her mother grabbed for her arms with a choked laugh. I suppose casting finite won't do the trick on this either. Harry remembered when Lily had first attempted to spell away the blue tint to Archie's hair that resulted from one of her first experiments with shaped imbuing. She smiled back as her mother tugged her back to the earth. Sorry, but I'll have to imbue the counter-charm. Didn't think of that. Lily anchored Harry with a half-embrace while she fished her wand from her sleeve and shot a bevy of green sparks into the sky toward the stadium. While her mother kept an eye on the sky, Harry awkwardly dug 5 additional vials of the base potion from her bag. She hesitated before imbuing them. Is there a specific counterspell for the levitation charm? Normally one would simply stop using the charm to negate it. Her mother frowned thoughtfully. No reason a simple finite incantatem shouldn't work, she said, tentatively. At the least, it won't hurt you. Harry nodded and closed her eyes to focus on shaping the cancellation spell without letting the magic manifest. She hadn't done this one before, but it didn't strain her abilities noticeably. When the vials warmed with the added magic, she drank one and coughed on reflex when the world imperiously exerted its will upon her once more mid-swallow. That was fast, she said, blinking as her muscles all began working at once to keep her upright once more. There's George and Ginny, Lily said, relief coloring her voice as she picked out their drifting forms against the sky. Harry squinted in the direction she pointed. Fred and I think Ron, too, she added. The others must have come one after the other once they'd seen the sparks. Slowly they were drifting into view out of the dark, like little boats set adrift through the sky. Mr. Weasley and Percy were close behind, and eventually all 3 Malfoys came into view, falling noticeably faster than the others as the combination of 2 weightless drafts worked against 1 levitation charm. Still, it was by no means a dangerous plummet. The family of 3 touched down a little ways short of their group, and Harry jogged over to give Draco the counterspell potion before he could drift off again. It took another minute or so for the first of the Weasleys to land, Ginny pushing away from her brother almost before her cancellation potion had been fully consumed. Harry was looking around for where the next pair would land when a jet of red light flew out of nowhere and caught Fred square in the chest. He and Ron were spun wildly off course by the force of the spell, a stunner. She told herself to keep the panic at bay, and Harry lost sight of them as they were swallowed up by the night sky. Another red jet flew toward Mr. Weasley, but Percy somehow managed to get a shield up around them both before it impacted. They landed a few moments later, breathless but intact. Harry pressed a potion to Percy, who spluttered as it kicked in and said, "Who in the blazes was shooting at us?" "Some panicked evacuee who thought we were the masked assailants returning," Mr. Weasley said, worry keeping his voice clipped. "We've got to find your brothers. Did you see which direction they were knocked?" Percy shook his head, but Draco spoke up. "They were diverted north-northwest," he said. After a moment of hesitation he added, reluctantly, "toward the tents." Mr. Weasley's face went white, but he straightened at once, not an ounce of fear in his expression, and said, "Boys, watch your sister. Do not leave this spot." "Dad, you haven't got a wand," George protested. "Let one of us find them." "I'm not losing any more of you in this crowd," Mr. Weasley bit off sharply. "We've no time to argue. Stay put." Harry had never heard the man more resolute. Still, she thought it folly for him to go off searching for Fred and Ron on his own. Even if he could have performed the locator charm, there was no telling what sort of trouble he might run into along the way. "I will go," Lily said suddenly. Harry turned to look at her mother, whose voice was fierce with earnestness. When Mr. Weasley began to shake his head, Lily put a hand on his shoulder gently. "I have use of my wand, Arthur. I will find your youngest sons. Harry, stay with the Weasleys." "I can help," she said, but her mother cut her off with a brisk hand gesture. "You have helped enough, Harry. Hold this for me." Lily dropped a delicately engraved bracelet into Harry's open palm. It was her suppressor. When had she taken it off? The air around Lily seemed positively charged with energy. Her hair floated just a bit too far from her head to be purely windborne. She seemed to glow with an unearthly vitality as she touched Harry's head and said, "If the wards drop, use your emergency portkey to get home. Otherwise, stay here until I return." "I will watch over her," Mr. Weasley vowed, worry fighting with gratefulness on his face. "You have enough children to keep safe." Mr. Malfoy stepped up and placed a hand on the back of Harry's neck. She gaped up at him like an idiot for half a second before her poise caught up to her surprised disbelief. "We will look after Miss Potter," he continued. "It is the least we can do, after she liberated us all from the stadium's confines." Lily looked hard at the impassive pureblood for a long moment. When she nodded, it was slow and deliberate. There was acceptance in her eyes, but also a warning. Only the hint of a smile gracing Mr. Malfoy's mouth revealed his awareness of the unspoken threat. With a last look at Harry, her mother took off in the direction Ron and Fred had been blasted. The smoke coming from the burning campgrounds had drifted in the wind, and Lily's jogging form was swallowed in hazy darkness before long. Their group huddled together in the night air somewhat awkwardly, at first. The Weasleys were to a one pale and worried. She could easily read the helpless frustration on their faces as they waited while two of their own were potentially in danger. She could just as easily read the Malfoys' polite attempts at not noticing the Weasleys' distress. The combination was both unhelpful and painfully charged. Finally, Draco broke the tension. Those two are clever. They'll find somewhere safe to wait, keep an eye out for help. Ron is handy with a wand, too. They'll be all right. Mr. Weasley nodded his thanks for Draco's words, and said, "No doubt we will all see the night out safely." No sooner had the words been uttered than an explosion rippled through the night, far from where they stood but nevertheless alarming in its sudden appearance against the sky. It was in the direction Lily had been running, somewhere amidst the burning field of tents. The initial explosion was followed immediately by a series of bright flashes and bangs, almost in mockery of the situation's severity. People screamed and fled into the tree line rather than attempt to skirt the spreading flames. There was little hope of anyone getting to the portkey and apparition points beyond the wards at this point. All such locations were on the other side of the fiery camping grounds. Harry's group pressed closer together to avoid being separated by the flood of witches and wizards rushing into the woods around them. It was several minutes before the whistles and bangs ebbed to the point that conversation was possible again. "Some fool's fireworks stash caught fire," no doubt Mr. Malfoy deduced. "It won't be the last," his wife added. "There will be many with such piles in their tents, awaiting the end of the match celebrations." "That's not the only thing in those tents," Ginny said, eyes bright despite the darkness. "I saw at least a few Krupps as we were walking around earlier, and pets aren't allowed in the stadium." Harry grimaced, and, cruel though it was, silently hoped that Krupps were the worst of the casualties that would be revealed in the aftermath. With this many people in a state of fearful distress, there was a high risk of people getting trampled in the haste of others. Who would do something like this? George asked, shaking his head a bit helplessly. He was visibly uncomfortable with his brother's disappearance and seemed to be looking for a topic to distract himself. "Radicals," Mr. Weasley said shortly. "Anti-Muggle renegades," someone nearby added sharply. Harry couldn't see the speaker. There were a number of groups huddled close along the tree line like they were. The woods had grown quiet as the stadium slowly emptied and people settled in to wait for the wards to go down or the Aurors to gain control of the scene. "It doesn't concern us," a witch said, her voice huffy and dismissive. "It does when they attack an international sporting event," someone else loudly interjected. "This is going to take weeks to mop up. We don't even know how many were injured or, Merlin forbid, killed tonight. Pure bloods, some of them, I don't doubt," Mr. Malfoy pointed out. Harry frowned upon realizing the conclusion of that train of thinking. "You'd think they'd pick their target more carefully, if it was Muggles they're after," Draco snorted. Harry moved her eyes slowly over her friend's face, wondering what exactly he found so amusing in all of this. "It wasn't Muggles or even Muggleborns they were after," Harry said, voice flat. Those around them grew quiet at her proclamation. It was everyone else. Draco frowned at her, discomfort in his expression that was probably caused by the riot of emotions she was struggling to keep contained. "That's what I mean," he said slowly. "Attacking a mixed event like this means the majority of affected aren't the ones they claim to be against." "Why?" "They're laying the foundation," Mr. Weasley said suddenly. He was looking at Harry with disturbed realization. She nodded. "This attack was meant to scare, not actually injure or kill many people directly. That's why they dropped pamphlets. It was aimed at those who associate with Muggleborns, which includes a great number of half-bloods and purebloods. Like my uncle. Like my cousin. Like me. Like you," she added, raising her chin challengingly at the Malfoys. At the unease she caught flickering through their eyes she tilted her head. "You sat in the top box with my mother and shook her hand, didn't you? And now you're scared, because that fleeting association might make you a target next, or at least that's the obvious conclusion these people want you to draw, isn't it?" The point of tonight was to scare as many people as possible into not associating with Muggleborns. To make people retreat from those they might have spoken for out of fear for themselves. And when they do start attacking Muggleborns and their families, the rest of the wizarding world will stand by and do nothing, Mr. Weasley said grimly. It's the same tactics Grindelwald's supporters used before launching their war. First they terrified the sector of society they didn't have a grudge with, just to keep them out of the way. Then they moved to exterminate the undesirables, the squibs, the less popular species of magical beings like hags and goblins, vampires and banshees. Those groups were unlikely to receive popular support from the wider public anyway. When they moved on to Muggleborns and eventually Muggles themselves, the magical communities of Europe were numb to the killings, too afraid for their own families to mount even a token resistance. After a moment of stark silence, a shaky voice came from the trees behind them. Surely you aren't suggesting this is the start of a war? It's just a political demonstration gone awry, someone else said, a forced chuckle attempting to lighten the air. Probably drunks, looking to let off a little steam. If these so-called Death Eaters can be believed, we'll find out soon enough, I'd wager, Mr. Weasley said darkly. The Malfoys didn't add anything else to the conversation. Harry peered at Mr. Malfoy and couldn't help but wonder if the Sow party had anything to do with the attack. She was tempted to think that it wasn't really Riddle's style, but then again, what did she really know of the man? He was hard to predict. It was only a short while later that Lily, Fred, and Ron emerged from the sea of choking smoke and stumbled toward them. Harry wondered why the three were hobbling so awkwardly, until she realized Ron was being towed between the other two. His levitation charm potion hadn't worn off yet, evidently. Harry had a dose already prepared, and in short order Ron was laughing weakly in relief as his feet met the earth. "Thanks, Harry," he said, grimacing at her. "No offense, but your potions are kind of scary." The gangly redhead was caught in an embrace by his father, who checked him over briskly for injuries. Fred, meanwhile, was receiving the same treatment from his twin. George clapped his hands on Fred's cheeks and gasped in dismay. "Freddie! What have you done?" Fred frowned, lifting a hand to his face as though to check it was still attached. "What?" George shucked his jumper and the thin t-shirt beneath, then began shredding it into long strips without pause. Mr. Weasley looked at Fred with alarm, but there was no obvious cause for panic, just a small, already scabbing cut on his right temple. He sighed. "Son, there's no need to. I'll save you, Freddie." George pounced. He had 3.5 strips wrapped around his twin's head like a makeshift turban before Fred managed to escape. Everyone had a good laugh as it became clear George was having them on. Ginny punched George in the arm with a scull. "Don't scare us like that." "That was not amusing," Percy said, sniffing. "Not clever, either," Draco said, smirking. As the Weasleys looked over uncertainly, he added, "Should have had Potter heal him, unless you'd like people to be able to tell you apart now." Twin looks of horror bled quickly to pleading as they whipped toward Harry's amused face. "I can fix it," she assured them, gesturing for Fred to unwrap his bandaged head. She held her wand mostly in her sleeve as she sealed the cut. She didn't put it past Draco to notice she was once again using Rigel's wand, if he saw it up close. As she finished, a tremble beneath their feet caused several people nearby to shriek. Harry smiled, however. "That'll be the wards going down," she said. "Which ones?" Ron asked. "Portkey or anti-apparition?" "Hopefully everything but the Muggle repellers," Mr. Weasley murmured. "One way to know," Narcissa said, placing her hand on her son's arm. "Try your portkey, Draco." Draco gave them all a last look before pulling his heir's watch from his pocket. "Safe travels," he told them, somewhat awkwardly. "Manada Malfoy." He vanished with a pop. With a short nod at the rest of them, Mr. and Mrs. Malfoy turned on the spot and disappeared as well. There were shouts of joy as people throughout the forest realized they could apparate and portkey out. Pops crackled through the trees like firecrackers as witches and wizards left in droves. "Thank you for finding my boys," Mr. Weasley said, clasping Lily's shoulders in a brief but heartfelt exchange. "Get home safe." "You as well," Lily said. She held out a hand for Harry to take, and the last thing Harry saw as she was sidelong apparated was the Weasleys crowding around a small handkerchief. The world rematerialized on her front lawn. Lily led the way back into the house, though the look on her face suggested she didn't expect to find James home just yet. Harry stepped into the living room to see Remus setting aside a hefty book and rising from the couch with a slight frown. "Addie is asleep upstairs," Remus said. "What's going on?" "Sirius came running in an hour ago and practically jumped through the flue, ranting about paranoid younger brothers with unplottable estates." "Where's James?" "He's fine," Lily said, distractedly glancing at the ceiling in the direction of Addie's room. "I'll explain," Harry offered. "Go check on Addie, Mum." Lily nodded gratefully and swept up the stairs. Harry sat and ran through the events after the cup match with her uncle. By the time she'd finished, Lily had whipped up a pot of hot chocolate and brought mugs of it into the living room as they settled in to wait for James and Sirius' return. Harry caught a whiff of something sharper than chocolate as her mother's mug passed her nose, but she didn't comment on it. She wasn't old enough to drink, but that didn't mean she didn't understand the appeal. In times of stress she developed an acute longing for a calming potion. The long evening, warm fire, and sweet chocolate drink all conspired to make Harry drowsy. She found herself dozing off as the night wore on, and it was some time later that a noise from the flue room drew her awake with an unpleasant lurch. She winced at the crick in her neck from where she'd laid it on her chair's arm as she rose. James was there in the doorway, Sirius close behind him, both looking exhausted and drawn, but altogether unharmed. After hugs and health checks all around, the two men sat and related the long and short of it. "The ministry is wound tighter than a top over this," James said. "Only, it's for all the wrong reasons. Officials are running around babbling about press releases and international political fallout, but no one is stopping to ask themselves how this happened. Security was nothing to sneeze at in that stadium. These assailants slipped in, with Merlin knows how many smuggled or stolen brooms, and they evaded every patrol and pursuit. This was not some drunken accident, it was well planned and expertly executed." "Do we know how the campgrounds caught fire?" Harry asked. "It would have been difficult for the fleeing attackers to stop and orchestrate without being caught." "No," James said wearily. "The arson brigade is still investigating. We're lucky everyone was still in the stadium when it happened. If the fire had been later, after people got back to their tents for the night." He didn't need to finish that train of thought. "At least Sirius managed to find Regulus and get the wards down," Lily said. "We didn't see any major stampedes. It could have been much worse. They might have been down sooner, if Reggie didn't think I was roaring drunk when I found him," Sirius said, somewhat bitterly. Harry supposed showing up in nothing but trousers and body paint, pouring out words about an attack on the World Cup would make anyone cautiously skeptical, and Regulus Black's opinion of his brother was lower than most. "No one was killed in the evacuation," James said, shaking his head. "There were incidents of near tramplings and a few were injured in the crushing crowds, but the deaths we know of so far all occurred after the initial attack, when the stands became destabilized. The top box suffered the most damage, but surrounding areas were affected, as well. We found a half-dozen people in the scaffolding below, either too close to the rails when they shook or the victims of falling debris from above." Lily squeezed his arm and glanced meaningfully at Harry, who blew out a long breath. She'd known since seeing the top box split in two that it was unlikely no one had been seriously injured as a result. She just hadn't been dwelling on it. Now, there was nothing else to think about. People had died that night, people not so removed in time and space from where she had been. She had seen death before, in the lower alleys, in the Chamber of Secrets, in the Forbidden Forest, but never had it seemed so meaningless. Those people had nothing to do with whatever statement the masked wizards or witches had been attempting to make. Why would anyone cause such reckless suffering? It was so thoughtless, so unnecessary. She could feel her magic stirring restlessly beneath her skin and had to fight to keep from letting her parents see how upset she was becoming. It wasn't for the reasons they would assume, and she wasn't sure she could explain properly. Words had taken a backseat to emotion, currently. "I'm going to bed," she said, standing and collecting the mugs from the table. "I'm glad you're home safe, Dad, Uncle Sirius. See you in the morning." Her parents hugged her one last time, both troubled but wise enough to realize she didn't want to talk at the moment. She wanted to sleep. Not to forget, she would never forget, but to regroup her mind and come to terms with all the changes that would be wrought on the world in the aftermath of that night. The battleground was shifting, and she had to decide how to move with it. -0. HP. -0. The next morning's paper displayed an image of the stadium mid-attack, the skull and snake emblem an ugly stain across the sky. Terror at the Quidditch World Cup. Last night's sporting event was marred by a vicious assault on the stadium itself as masked renegades stormed the winning team's celebration and bombarded the field with inflammatory pamphlets supporting blood discrimination at its most extreme. Witnesses say the assailants appeared like ghosts from the night, striking at the minister's box and nearly causing the deaths of dozens of government officials and foreign dignitaries. Minister Fudge admits, "I barely escaped with my life." Wizarding communities across the world are outraged at this blatant terrorist attack against magical Britain and her allies. Errors report at least a dozen deceased as a result of this attack. The families of those brave witches and wizards are demanding answers, and so far the ministry seems at a loss to explain how the most elaborately publicized and extensively organized event of the year was subject to such poor security practices that an unknown number of miscreants were able to wreak havoc with impunity upon innocent bystanders. Also unclear is who exactly these assailants were. Was it an act of terrorism? Of war? Or just a political rebellion gone awry? All that is clear at this time is that the so-called Death Eaters are a serious new organization willing to take political views outside of the realm of politics and into the lives of ordinary citizens regardless of affiliation. Ministry press releases state that in the future, alcohol sales at public events will be curtailed and all spectators subject to more thorough inspection, and in some cases searching, prior to event entry. Whether this will be enough to stop another such incident is something only time will tell. -0, 0, 0. -0, 0. -0. End of chapter 4.